Let's go to Canberra now and catch up with the Shadow Industry Minister Andrew Hastie. He's had a busy day there in Parliament, was delayed by a division. Thanks for joining us, Andrew. Good to talk to you again. Now, I showed at the start of my program, among other things, a clip of the former Liberal leader Malcolm Turnbull focusing on UN approval for the war against Iran and calling this an illegal war. What do you think about this legalistic reliance on the United Nations and disregard, I suppose, for the greater security and moral imperative for this war?
Well, good evening, Chris. I said this morning that I think the rules-based global order is dead and buried. And so these sorts of legal arguments are nice, but we live in the world of reality. And what we've seen over the last decade is a complete disruption to the world that we knew after the Second World War, which was underwritten by US power, largely naval power. And now we're in a new phase where we've seen the US conduct strikes in Nigeria. They've removed the president of Venezuela, and now we're at war with Iran. So this is a new world, and it's disorientating for us, but we've got to grapple with it, and we've got to start thinking about how we protect Australia and our national interests going forward.
See, the way I view this is I agree with you that the rules-based order is finished, but it was never adhered to anyway. I think Western countries like the US constantly tied one hand behind their back trying to adhere to it, while countries like Russia, China and Iran, importantly, never made any pretence.
Look, it was a nice Western construct, and it was the sort of thing that you talked about at, diplomatic dinner parties, but the world in reality is very different, and this is something that our foreign policy makers particularly need to grapple with. It has flow-on effects in a number of areas, but particularly in industry, and that's why I'm focused on looking at ways that we can rebuild our industrial base to make sure that we have a level of sovereign capability which in a crisis will give us flexibility and resilience, and that's something that I think for the last 20 years we've ignored and neglected, and it's not good enough.
Absolutely. We need energy and industry security, and I'll talk to you about those issues again another time. But I want to focus now on the so-called ISIS brides. I prefer to call them the Islamic State families getting back into the country, and you and others pressed the government on this today to make them deny, which they couldn't, that any minister or anyone involved in the government had put any pressure on, done anything to help out with passports for these families. Have a look at the Prime Minister's answer.
I do thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question and for his obsession with this issue. If only, Mr. Speaker, he was as obsessed when ISIS fighters were coming home on their watch.
This is amazing stuff, Andrew. The argument seems to be from the government that we haven't helped them, it's our public servants that have helped them. There seems to be this ridiculous division between what is part of the Albanese government and what is part of the bureaucracy.
Well, in the end, we have a Westminster system where ministers are accountable for their departments. And so if the Home Affairs Department, if the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has been assisting with the repatriation of ISIS sympathisers, then the government, particularly the ministers, Minister Penny Wong and Minister Tony Burke, have questions to answer. Ultimately, it's the Prime Minister who presides over Cabinet, and he is ultimately accountable to the Australian people. So to regard our line of questioning as an obsession, I think is ridiculous. There is nothing wrong with being obsessive about protecting Australians and our way of life, and that is what the Leader of the Opposition, Angus Taylor, and his team were doing today in Parliament. And
I'm certain most Australians agree with you. Just to illustrate that point, I want to share with you some of a conversation that Ben Fordham had on Radio 2GB today with Sarah, not her real name, but she's a woman who's been to authorities years ago about one of these women who is now an ISIS bride, speaking to her before she was a mother and when someone was trying to convince her to go back to school. Have a listen.
Well, just sitting around chatting as you do with your friends, and she didn't have any children at the time, so someone made the comment, why don't you go back to school before you have children? And she said, I'd rather learn how to make bombs.
This is alarming stuff, especially when you consider that Sarah, not her real name, who knew this woman who was now an ISIS bride, says that she wouldn't trust her back in the country. She worries for the safety of her own children if we let her back in.
Well, that's right. These women chose to join with the Islamic State Caliphate. They believe the ideology. They hold to these militant political Islamic views, and they're a risk to our society. Let's not forget that one of the Bondi shooters was born here, raised here, schooled here and radicalised here. And so the risk is bringing back these ISIS sympathisers who haven't repudiated their beliefs, who still hold to Islamic State ideology. They'll be a risk to our communities. They'll be celebrated in some quarters, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And that's why the government should be doing everything to hold them back from coming to Australia.
Andrew Hastie, thanks so much for joining us. Andrew Hastie there, who's now the Shadow Industry Minister and Minister for Sovereign Capabilities.